In 2012, the streets of Manchester saw one of the most tragic, unprovoked, and unexplained murders. And the killer, that branded himself a psycho, made sure to stay as close to the crime scene as he possibly could. So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about the tragic murder of Anuj Bidve. But quickly, before we get into the case, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Wild. Wild is a natural deodorant brand that I have been using for coming up on a year now. I started using them last spring was when I made the switch. Their products are made from all natural ingredients, including shea butter, or shea butter. We had this debate on Twitter the other day. I don't know how you pronounce it, but it makes your skin soft, makes your pits all moisturized and smooth. And Wild are all about sustainability, which is the main reason why I love them. All of their packaging is recyclable, and to be fair, the whole point of their products is to reduce waste. Because whenever you use a normal deodorant aerosol or roll-on, you just use it up and then throw that packaging away every single time, and Wild are trying to stop that. So basically what you do is you choose your case, and this is going to be your case forever. Mine's got my name on it, how cute. And then you get these cute little deodorant refills that you put inside your case, and then whenever you run out of one of the refills, you can just compost it and get a new one. You're not constantly throwing away deodorant cans. They have such a lovely range of scents. I've tried pretty much all of them at this point, and I love them all, but their newest limited edition Valentine's Day one, it's Peach Bellini. Peach Bellini! Anyone that knows me knows that I am a cocktail girl, so as soon as I heard this, I screamed. I let out a scream. It's so nice. It's so like peachy, prosecco-y. But yeah, their products are amazing, not only for your armpits, but also for the environment. I just love Wild. So if you want to try out Wild deodorants, there's a link down below in the description, and they're even giving you guys a discount code. If you use the code Neale20 at checkout, you'll get 20% off of your purchase. And trust me, you will love Wild. I do. I have for a year. So thanks again to Wild for sponsoring this video. Quickly, before we get into the case, I do just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. As far as content warnings go in this video, I don't think there's any major ones. I'm sorry if I haven't picked up on any, but I don't think there's actually any content warnings for this one, so let's just get straight into it. So today's case takes place in Manchester, England in 2011, but first let's take it back 23 years to when Anuj Bidve was born. It was July 18th, 1988 when Anuj was born in Pune, India. And he came from a very happy family. His mum and dad were still together. They were still just a really nice family unit. He had a sister as well. I don't know if she was older or younger, but they all got on really well. Anuj was an incredibly bright student all the way through school. He was so smart. He got insanely high grades in pretty much every single subject. There really wasn't much that Anuj couldn't do or couldn't do well. He just was like multi-talented. He was good in academics, he was good at sport, he was good at like everything. Eventually, he went on to university, and again, he excelled there. He was like one of the smartest kids in the whole university. But as Anuj got into his 20s, he started to like the idea of maybe finishing his studies abroad, going and studying in a foreign university, meet new people, explore a new country. So he did his research, and he decided that the best place for him to go would be England. And so he started looking at all these universities in England, and he found one in Lancaster. It was as soon as he found out he could do a master's in microelectronics at Lancaster University, that was what sold him. That was the course that he was interested in. That was what he wanted to do with his life. So that was it. In September of 2011, Anuj was 23 years old, and he left India. He left all of his family behind to come over to the UK for his studies. He very quickly settled into university life. He made friends very easy. Actually, a lot of the friends that he made were other students that had come over from India, so they could all relate to each other on a level that no one else really could. He found a lot of people that he had a lot in common with, and he made some really good social circles, and he was also smashing his uni work at the same time, of course. He was very happy with this new life, this new environment. He settled very well, very quickly. All of his teachers at university loved him, his tutors, his professors. One of them even said he was an outstanding applicant at the very beginning of a promising career. So his first few months at university were off to a cracking start. start, and then December rolls around, and it's time for everyone to go home for the Christmas holidays. But the only problem being for Anuj and his friends was that plane tickets back to India were so expensive over Christmas, and they're students. They don't have money to be spending on a plane ticket there and back. So the boys weighed up their options, and even though it would be sad to not be with their families for Christmas, they didn't really have much choice. And besides, if they all stayed in the UK together, then they could at least have a Christmas together. So that's exactly what they decided to do. They all came together and they decided that if they couldn't go home, they were going to make it as special as they could over here. And they were going to celebrate together, get each other presents and, you know, have Christmas here together. So in an attempt to make it feel like a special occasion and not just another day in their university accommodation, the boys decided to travel to Manchester for a few days and do Christmas in Manchester. I think the main reason that they did this was because they really wanted to go shopping in the Boxing Day sales the following day, because everything is so cheap on Boxing Day. Actually, it's not, but there's sales anyway. In fact, their plan was to wake up really, really, really early and set off walking into Manchester city centre to try and be like the first people there before the shops opened, so then they could get first dibs in the sales. But as Christmas Day came to an end, it was about midnight, 1 a.m-ish, and the boys were like, why don't we just not go to sleep? They didn't sleep, and they decided to just pull an all-nighter and then walk out into the shops. So just after 1 a.m, Anuj and 9 of his friends started walking into Manchester city centre. And it was quite a walk for them. I think the boys were staying more in like Salford area, which is about just short of an hour walk into Manchester city centre. They could have got there within like 20 minutes if they'd have got a car, but none of them drove and they didn't have the money for a taxi. So they all decided to just walk at 1 a.m. And they were trying to follow directions on one of their phones, because obviously they're not from the area. They have no idea how to get into the city centre. So they've got it up on their phones and they're all like walking, following it. And they get to Ordsall Road in Ordsall. And the group noticed 2 boys walking on the other side of the road. They were probably about the same age as Anuj and his friends. And they didn't really pay much attention to these 2 boys on the other side of the road, like at all. That was until when they got level with them, one of the 2 boys turned and crossed the road over to Anuj and his friends. So now they were forced to pay attention to this boy, and he starts walking towards him, and immediately they can tell he's angry. For some reason, he's looking for some sort of altercation here. So this guy comes over and he demands that one of Anuj and his friends give him the time. And so one of them does, they check their phone and they're like, oh, it's 1:30 a.m. And without saying a word, this guy just looked at the group, put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a handgun. And before the group could even process what was going on, this guy lifted the gun, aimed it at Anuj and shot him straight in the head. Anuj collapsed to the ground as the shooter screamed "run" to his friend, and the 2 of them fled the scene. And Anuj's friends were just left frozen, absolutely paralysed with shock and fear. Of course, they tried to call an ambulance as quickly as they possibly could, and instead of trying to chase after these attackers, they decided to just stay with their friend, who was now unconscious on the ground. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived at the scene, picked up Anuj and took him to the hospital, where he was sadly pronounced dead on arrival. He was just 23 years old, his life taken in the blink of an eye with absolutely no explanation, no reason why. So police came down to the hospital to speak with all of Anuj's friends and get the details of what had happened that night. However, none of them could really give that many details because this had been such a quick attack. It all happened literally in the blink of an eye, so his friends didn't really get a good look at the shooter. They could only give very vague, basic descriptions like grey top, white male. In fact, the description of the shooter was a white male, rather short in stature, slight build, around the same age as Anuj and his friends, probably early 20s, and they said that he was wearing a grey shirt. That's all they could tell the police. And the description of the other guy, the shooter's friend, was even more vague because he'd stayed on the other side of the road. He hadn't even come over close to the group. But still, the friends told police that he was also a white male with a slightly bigger build and he was wearing a black jacket. And that's all they could tell about him as well. So news of Anuj's murder started to break to the public that same morning. Not from the police. The police hadn't posted anything yet. It was just like word of mouth. It was just traveling around the town. And the police were actually really determined to keep what little information they did have under wraps. They didn't want to release anything to the media yet because they didn't want them posting anything. Because, for example, if it got out that police were looking for a guy in a grey t-shirt, then the murderer might see that, panic, and then go the extra mile to try and destroy this grey t-shirt or hide it or something. And that t-shirt would inevitably have a lot of evidence relating to this case, probably still on it, so police didn't want to risk losing that t-shirt. But by day 2 of the investigation, the media had already become an issue in this case. There was a lot of unconfirmed information being spread about. For example, when the media found out that Anuj and all of his friends were Indian and the 2 attackers were white, they suddenly took this to mean that it was a racially motivated hate crime. And so that's what they started posting, which it wasn't confirmed at all at that point. Police had no idea what had happened, so there was no way for them to say if it was racially motivated or not. The media had absolutely no evidence that this was a racially motivated hate crime, literally just the races of the people involved. That was the only thing that gave them that idea. Even Anuj's friends were saying that they really didn't think it was a hate crime. Police said that it seemed a lot more like a crime of opportunity. It didn't seem as though the killer had gone out intentionally looking for someone of a particular race to murder that night. It seemed that they were just looking to murder someone, anyone, and Anuj was that person. Of course, at this point in the case, they weren't going to rule it out. It was still a possibility that this could have been racially motivated. However, they really didn't think it was. In the days following Anuj's murder, all of his friends took to social media to post all their nice memories with him, all their condolences and just nice posts to celebrate his life. And it was actually through these social media posts that Anuj's family back home in India found out about their loved one's murder. They hadn't been informed by the police. They found out by logging onto Facebook and seeing people post that their son was dead. In defense of the police in this situation, I don't want to fully defend them because I don't know the exact details, but they did try and get hold of Anuj's parents, but because of the time zones and they had very hectic work schedules, they just couldn't get in contact with them for a couple of days, and so unfortunately that is how they found out. But this was just the first of many frustrations for Anuj's family throughout this investigation. Right now, they felt like the police just were not doing enough to find their son's killer. Remember I said the police were trying to keep as much of this investigation under wraps as possible? They weren't releasing things to the media just yet. Well, to Anuj's family over in India, who are only seeing the investigation through news articles, it looked like police weren't doing anything. There was no new information about the investigation being released, and so to Anuj's family back home, this was really disappointing. Little did they know that it was for the good of the investigation. Rest assured, and I don't defend the police often, but in this case, they were really putting in the work. They went out and found hundreds of hours of CCTV footage from the general area. They took it all back to the police station. They had so many officers looking through hours and hours and hours of footage. They wanted to try and figure out where the killer and his friend had come from or where they'd run off to, because maybe that could help them figure out who it was. Although there wasn't actually any CCTV footage of Anuj's murder, there weren't any cameras on that road, but there were in the area. So they were trying to piece together where the shooter and his friend had gone. They also had a bunch of other officers out doing door-to-door inquiries, asking neighbours if they'd seen or heard anything that night. They were doing forensic tests, they were doing an autopsy, ballistic tests to be able to figure out what kind of bullet, what kind of gun had shot Anuj, had been used to shoot Anuj rather. And even though that is a lot of work that I've just listed to you, these police officers moved fast in this case because within 3 days, they'd made an arrest. But actually not just one arrest, 5. They had 5 different suspects in custody at this point in time, and they wanted to interview all 5 of them and, figure out if they're the killer. All of these boys were between the ages of 16 and 20, and they all matched the descriptions that Anuj's friends gave of the attacker and his friends. So all 5 of these suspects were put through a very intense interview process. However, as time was going by, police were really struggling to actually connect any of these 5 boys with the murder. It was hard because there was really little physical evidence to go off in this case. They had no murder weapon, they had no definite CCTV footage of the murder. There were hardly any witnesses, and the ones that did see it, it was way too fast for them to even be able to help in this investigation. So it was really hard for police to be able to put anything on any of these boys that they had in custody. But then a few days later, on New Year's Eve, the 31st of December, 5 days after Anuj was murdered on the 26th, police released 4 of these 5 boys from custody, and 1 remained. 20-year-old Kiaran Stapleton had grown up on the Orshall estate right where Anuj was killed. It was a council estate, or mainly a council estate, just west of Manchester city centre, and it didn't have the best reputation. In fact, it had really quite a bad reputation for antisocial behaviour, rowdiness, violence. And Kiaran Stapleton matched the descriptions that all of Anuj's friends gave of the shooter. And so police decided to look into him a lot closer. They decided to pull up all this CCTV footage again to see if they could spot Kieran anywhere, especially now that they knew he lived so close. He lived on the estate right next to where Anuj was murdered. And sure enough, in the early hours of the morning on Boxing Day, police saw 2 white males walking down the street in the direction of where the murder would soon take place. And one of these boys on this footage looked a whole lot like Kiaran Stapleton. But I mean, they couldn't say that for sure, because it still wasn't, the best quality CCTV picture. They needed supporting evidence. This wasn't very strong. And they didn't really have to look far for this supporting evidence, because it seemed that Kiaran Stapleton, in the days following the murder, he'd gotten a fresh tattoo. A teardrop tattoo on his face. If you're unfamiliar with the symbolism behind teardrop tattoos, it's a thing in gang culture. For every teardrop that someone gets tattooed on their face, that is one person that they've murdered. So for every teardrop, that's another kill. And it seemed that Kieran had got his first ever teardrop tattoo in the days following Anuj's murder. It really wasn't looking good for Kiaran Stapleton at this point, but things were about to get even worse when police found out that for the past few days, since the murder, he had been living in a hotel. But not just any hotel, a hotel that literally overlooked the murder scene, overlooked the investigation that was going on below. And that is so eerie. For a killer to go and check themselves into a hotel room that they know will look over the devastation that they've caused, he was doing that because he was enjoying it. He wanted to be around the tragedy that he had caused. Well, for police, this was more than enough evidence for them to charge Kiaran Stapleton with the murder of Anuj Bidve. But they knew that he wasn't the only person that they were looking for. Remember, he had a friend. He was there with a friend that night, and they both ran away together. So now they needed to find him. And it wasn't going to be that hard, because they literally just asked Kieran who it was, and he said, oh, it was my mate Ryan Holden. So now police had his full name, they got straight in contact with Ryan, and right off the bat, they noticed that Ryan was scared. He was nervous, he was visibly scared of the police and this investigation. But as they got talking to Ryan, they realised that the reason he was scared was actually because of Kieran. He was scared of Kieran and his connections. He didn't want to snitch on his friend in case Kieran sent someone to hurt him or his family. Because apparently Kieran had some scary friends, some scary connections, and Ryan knew that. So police evaluated how much of an actual risk this was for Ryan. Was he just making this up to get out of it, or was he actually telling the truth? And they realised that he wasn't exaggerating. Kieran and his associates were dangerous. They'd killed before. It seemed that Kieran was now a murderer, and there's nothing to stop them from killing again. And so for that reason, police offered Ryan some sort of protection. It wasn't identity protection, but they offered him some support and help. And finally, Ryan felt comfortable enough to open up to police and tell them absolutely everything about that night. So he started by telling the police that Kiaran Stapleton had actually recently split up with his girlfriend just before the murder, and he was not in a good way mentally. He was in a very emotional state, a very reactive state. Not in terms of like he was crying and like down and mopey, more in the way that he was angry and he was lashing out on people. He was mad at his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend. I'm not sure what the exact reason for their breakup was. However, this was only one of many problems for Kieran. He'd obviously been kicked out of the house that he shared with that girlfriend, so now he was kind of homeless. He was staying with different people. I think he went back to live with his mum or something, but he'd also had his driver's license taken off him. He was just going through it at this point in time. He had a lot of things going on in his life that were just adding to this stress, and he was becoming a very, very angry person, and he was taking this aggression out on everyone around him. But the real kicker was when Kieran found out that his now ex-girlfriend had been cheating on him when they were together. And this just made him furious. It absolutely sent him over the edge. He was saying stuff to Ryan like, if I see him, I'll kill him. Obviously meaning the guy that his ex cheated with. I'm not sure why Ryan and Kieran were out walking the streets of Manchester at 1:30 a.m. that night, but Ryan remembers the first time he saw Anuj and all of his friends on the other side of the road. Immediately, Ryan said that he could tell that Anuj and all of his friends were not from around that area. They weren't from that part of Manchester. They could tell because they were following directions on their phone. And I actually have a direct quote from one of the boys who said they were all dark-skinned and not dressed like Salford people. Anuj and his friends hadn't even really noticed Ryan and Kieran on the other side of the road. They were all just too busy talking to each other, laughing, joking, having fun. So as they kept walking down the street and they got in line with Anuj and all of his friends, Kieran turned to his friend Ryan and said, "Hang on a minute." And then he crossed the road over to where Anuj was. Ryan said he couldn't hear anything on the other side of the street. He literally just stood and waited for Kieran on the other side. Although he did see Kieran lift his arm and kind of do a watch gesture as he was asking for the time. But the next thing Ryan knew, he was watching Kieran pulling a handgun out of his pocket, and within seconds, he shot Anuj and screamed, "Run." And so Ryan had seen all of this in the space of a few seconds, and he just panicked and ran with Kieran. So they ran back to Kieran's estate, into Kieran's house, and when they got there, Ryan was very distressed. He was panicked about this whole thing. Whereas Kieran was quite the opposite. He was very cool, calm, collected. He even told Ryan to chill the fuck out. Ryan was just proper stressing to Kieran, and Kieran said to him, "Nah, don't fold on me," meaning like don't snitch on me, don't give in. So that was the full story according to Ryan, and that was the most information police had in this whole case. At this point, Kieran was already charged with the murder, but this information was going to be very, very useful at trial. Speaking of which, he had his initial hearing a week after the murder on January 2nd, 2012. Kieran appeared in court, and when he was asked for his name, he stood up and said, "Kiaran Psycho Stapleton," which is just cringy more than anything. That was just his initial hearing. The actual trial didn't take place until later that year, but I thought it was important to say that because he's already bragging about the crime that he committed a week prior. So as this court hearing was going on, the Bidve family back over in India, they were growing very distressed because in Hindu culture, it's custom to cremate the deceased within 24 hours of their death. And by now, it had been a whole week since Anuj's murder, and his parents just could not get police to release his body back to them in India so that they could give him a funeral. And I mean, they understood why they couldn't have his body because it was part of a murder investigation. They needed to keep it there to do autopsies and tests and all this kind of stuff. And his family understood that, but it didn't make it any easier, of course. Their hearts were breaking that they couldn't give their son the send-off that they felt he needed. And everyone in Manchester just felt so sorry for the Bidve family. This case is terrible in so many ways, but especially the fact that this family found out about their boy's murder on Facebook. People just felt so bad that this family were in a different country, far away, they weren't getting proper communication, they couldn't be with their son, they couldn't have his body. It was just so heartbreaking on so many different levels. And the people of Manchester wanted to show the Bidve family that they had their support, that they were on their side. And so on January 2nd of 2012, a candlelit vigil was held for Anuj Bidve, and it was such a turnout. Over 400 people turned up. There were flowers, there were letters, messages, notes. everything. So much was left. All the bits and pieces, the flowers, the letters and everything were all arranged into a memorial for Anuj as well that people could go and visit. And as soon as the Bidve family found out over in India that this was going on in Manchester, they felt so comforted by it. The day after the candlelit vigil, the Bidve family were actually flown over to the UK for a number of reasons, so that they could help in the investigation, so that they could go and visit the memorial for their son, and most importantly, so that they could get his body back and take it back over to India with them so that they could have a funeral finally. But like I said, while they were here in the UK, they went and visited the memorial and they were just so taken aback by how much love and support was shown for their son. They read as many of these little letters and notes as they possibly could. One of them read, "Rest in peace, Anuj, unlike your murderer who will rot in hell." And Anuj's own mother wrote a very simple note to leave at the memorial saying, "To our dearest son Anuj, from Mummy and Papa and our family." So the next day, the family flew back to India with Anuj's body, and relatives back home in India had actually planned out this whole funeral for them while they'd been gone. It was an open casket funeral, and Anuj's body was going to be covered in flowers and carried around the streets of Pune. And the turnout was absolutely enormous. The streets were just lined with people on top of people. At the funeral, Anuj's father got up and made a speech, and I've got a little quote of that here. "When Anuj left India in September last year, he was full of hope and ambition for the future. We were all so very proud of him. Anuj was our only son, and we cannot comprehend this dreadful tragedy." Kiaran Stapleton's murder trial began in July of 2012, and he actually kicked it off by pleading not guilty to murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. But the prosecution quickly rejected this diminished responsibility excuse, saying if you deliberately fire a loaded gun at someone's head, you must intend to cause really serious injury or death. Kiaran Stapleton intended to kill. And of course, Kieran's defense team had no argument for this because it's true. How are they supposed to defend him on that? So as part of his trial and everything, Kieran was given psychiatric assessments because they thought it could be possible that he had some sort of mental illness or disorder that had led him to do this. So in these assessments, it was noted that he had a lot of antisocial personality traits. He didn't have antisocial personality disorder, but he had a lot of similar traits like lack of empathy. He was unable to feel guilt. He didn't have much remorse. So he had a lot of these traits, but it wasn't enough to diagnose him. The psychiatrist concluded that assessment saying that he didn't have any disorders or illnesses. He was, completely mentally sound. And so for that reason, his diminished responsibility excuse no longer stood. And the prosecution actually asked Kieran directly if he thought the results of his psychiatric assessments would mean he wouldn't have to go to prison. If he got found to have like an illness or a disorder, then he wouldn't go to prison. And Kieran responded, "To be honest, I'm not bothered. I love prison. Lock me up for 65 years. The trial went on for 5 long weeks, and as time went by, Kiaran Stapleton seemed to care less and less. He was starting to laugh and joke and giggle in the courtroom when they were saying all this stuff about the murder that he committed. He was enjoying this whole thing, mainly because it got him out of his prison cell for the day. He loved going to trial every day because it was something for him to do. Oh, I actually forgot to mention this earlier in the case, but I need to tell you this. At one point, he turned to the jury and he said, "Look at this face. Does it look bothered?" He's just so cringy more than anything. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury came back and found Kiaran Stapleton guilty of the murder of Anuj Bidve. They rejected the diminished responsibility excuse, of course, mainly due to the way that Kieran acted in the aftermath of the murder. He got a teardrop tattoo, literally just days after. He checked into a hotel that overlooked the crime scene. These are the kind of things that a killer will do when they're proud of what they've done, not when they've, committed a murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. So Kiaran Stapleton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. So the soonest he can get a parole hearing, at the very least, is 2042. And even then, he probably won't be let out because, let's be honest, he's shown zero remorse. If anything, he's shown the opposite of remorse. But that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks again to Wild for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to get 20% off of your order, you can use the code Neale20 at checkout, and there's a link down below in the description. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up, and if you did enjoy, you'll probably also enjoy this video. I'm gonna pick you one out, special. Or you can just subscribe to my channel because I post stuff like this all the time. Okay, bye!